Hi everyone, and today's screencast will identify what a performance assessment is. I think that's blocked out by the video of me. What its value is, and how to consider what kind of performance assessment to use for your rubric. So for purposes in this course, we're going to discuss an end-of-unit performance assessment. Generally, performance assessments can be given in a kind of more restricted form. At the end of a lesson, it could be a type of daily assessment, but we're going to think about large-scale performance assessments at the end of the unit, and that's what you're going to be asked to design. So the first question we need to ask is, why a performance assessment? What's wrong with what we just did last week with our traditional end-of-unit assessment? So let's just first identify some issues and challenges with the traditional form of testing. And no better way to do it than to call upon our very own Calvin. I'll give you a second to read this. So clearly, one of the issues is that some students just don't test well. There's kind of, to some extent, there's art and science to test taking, and we hear that all the time, that I just don't know how to, I don't test well. I'm not good at figuring out multiple choice answers or true or false, and there's something to that. And I'm sure you've had experience either with yourself or with others of students who know the content, but on the test can't demonstrate that. There's also the limitation of a test in that in tests we present isolated bits of information, and students don't see a connection to it. They don't see a significance to it, and it's just seen as something that the teacher needs to know for my classroom and now. But what significance does this have, or how is this part of anything larger or bigger? And as this testing demonstrates, what's the significance? I don't know. There's no significance. This is just an isolated question on a test, and students don't see that. And related to what we just said is just the notion of, I don't care. This is just a useless piece of information. I think it's very important consideration, because when designing our units or what we choose to teach, we have to have an answer to that question. Why am I teaching this? Why is it important for my students to know this? And this is also related to some of the readings, and Bruner, Tyler, Adler, and we'll read some more theorists later in the semester. But what's the answer to that question? Why do we want students to know this? And it has to be beyond the four walls of the classroom. It has to be that we want them to know this for something. There has to be a larger picture, a larger application, and that's what performance assessments address, and that's what we should be forced to ask ourselves. What, in the larger sense, would we like our students to do with this learned content? So that's what brings us to performance assessment. It's sort of a project that involves a demonstration. It's kind of a synthesis of unit goals to design something real, that has real life application, that shows the ability to do something with the goals in a meaningful way. So just to define some terms, I don't know, you might have heard it or been familiar with this. Maybe you've heard authentic assessment, alternative assessment, performance-based. You probably heard project-based assessment. You probably heard problem-based assessment. You probably heard problem-based learning or project-based learning. So I'm going to some extent, define these different terms, but don't worry so much. Alternative assessment just means any assessment other than the traditional paper and pencil test that we discussed last week. A performance assessment is an example of an alternative assessment. Now, an authentic assessment is, and it's very important to understand what authentic assessment means and what authenticity means. But I did give you a link to a short video on authentic assessment, which I asked you to view after this. So authentic assessment is assessing in a way that matches real life as much as possible. It matches what you want students to do with this content as much as possible. It's authentic to real world application. And anything that we teach has a real world application. Think about what you're teaching. Why do you want our students to know this? Why do we want them to know this Parak and Navi? What do we want them to do with this information? And everything involves doing. We don't want it to just sit as disparate pieces of information in a student's head. Even if they're doing something with it mindfully in their heads, what do we want them to do with that content? And that's what a performance assessment asks students to do. And I gave these little graphics just to kind of, in almost a silly way, but to apply it to our units, this concept. So that if we want to teach students, if we want our students to know how to bake a cupcake, I could give them a multiple choice and ask them, well, what's the next ingredients? How do you mix these things together? How much baking powder do I put in? But obviously the most authentic way to determine whether students can bake a cupcake is to have them bake the cupcake. So there's something very different than having the knowledge than demonstrating it. So I could assess the knowledge. I could assess even the deeper way. Do I understand why baking powder mixes with the flour and the eggs and sugar and how it works in the oven? I could even assess that on a paper and pencil, but the real meaningful assessment comes with actually doing. The same thing with driving. Obviously, the most meaningful and authentic way to see if students know how to drive is to actually have them drive. So we're going to identify other benefits, but this relates well to what you read in the UBD on what is understanding, and I'm sure you noticed the word transfer come up, and that's what we really want to do. We want students to be able to transfer what they learned to the real life that they confront, whether it's now and whether it's later. We want the students to see meaning in what they're doing, and there should be that level of authenticity. And this is where the big ideas also come into play, in that students, in a performance assessment for sure, we should see those big ideas, those enduring understanding, those essential questions surface, and everything should be brought together. Design an assessment that encompasses a number of unit goals that relates very strongly to our big ideas. So students are able to answer, oh, this is why we're learning, this is how it all is connected. Okay, just want to distinguish for you performance assessment and performance-based assessment, and problem-based learning, project-based learning. The big buzz in education is PBL, is project-based and problem-based learning. So we're going to discuss this more, problem-based learning, when we discuss the third leg of our UBD structure for this course. We did goals. Next, we're doing assessment, and then we're going to do learning activities. So we're going to do this more. But you're going to see this, and I gave you some resources. You should just be familiar with it because it's going to inform how you design your performance assessment. But basically, a performance assessment is an assessment at the end of the unit that, again, encompasses a lot of your goals, that has students perform and do something and create something that meaningful, that shows why we're learning this. That's a demonstration of big ideas. Problem-based learning is basically the same idea. Problem-based learning also results in a assessment at the end that's meaningful, that's big, that's great. But the whole learning throughout the unit is all geared towards this assessment, meaning they get the assessment at the beginning of the unit. Something like, you are tasked with designing a writing a pamphlet on Hilchos related to tzitzit or something. So what you need to do is write up this pamphlet, learn all the sources, and so the whole semester, instead of the teacher having worksheets or really driving what they're learning every day, the learning is driven by the students knowing what their outcome is and them building and creating towards this eventual outcome. So it's that same kind of assessment, but we're learning is driven throughout towards the final design of this assessment. This you don't need to know too much about, at least for now, just to know that, as I mentioned earlier, there are kind of small kind of assessment restricted performances, and there are examples given in the book that are you might give at the end of the day that are not as grand, but they also have students perform and do something, and I'm giving a real life scenario and having them apply it. So that's more restricted. And extended is when it's more comprehensive, and comprehensive involves a lot of unit goals and kind of you bringing the unit together through this end of unit assessment. And I don't know if you can see the last bullet often includes several smaller tasks that can be assessed separately but are part of a bigger task. Okay, so I asked you to read the UBD chapter, and please refer to that, but just to consider performance assessment and as a demonstration of true understanding. So again, performance assessments, you'll see the big ideas in play. You'll have that transferability. You'll have that synthesis. We're talking about deep understanding because it can incorporate your knowledge goals. Often they do performance assessments, but when you're synthesizing them and towards the creation of something bigger, that reflects true understanding. Okay, we spoke about this already just now and the demonstration of understanding. So what is this performance assessment going to look like? So basically you're designing a product. These are just a couple of examples of different products that you can design. It can be anything. And I gave you on Canvas a list of other different examples of what that product could be. It could be a debate. It could be, it could be anything. But again, they're just creating something. And that creation could be something that they give over orally. It could be in writing. It could be through video. Something that unites the goals in a way that requires them to synthesize, take it to the next level, transfer, and show why they should care, bringing back to that Calvin cartoon of why it's important. And they should do something with that information in a way that's important. Now, how would you determine which performance tests to choose? So I gave you, for example, a bunch of products. Now, how do you decide what to do? Should it be a newspaper? Should it be a diary? Should it be something else? The answer to that is it depends on your goals. It depends on what you want students to do with this unit information. For example, I'll give a simple example. If the main primary goal, as exhibited through your learning goals, as exhibited even in your big ideas, is that it's important for students to know the storyline of what went on in Yetzias Mitzrayim, or what the sequence of events were for a period in history, because that is integral to understanding where I am today, then your assessment might be something where they are demonstrating and showing that they know that storyline. And that could be through some sort of comic strip. That could be through some sort of